The sound of a shattered porcelain vase was an ugly, final thing. It was the sound of something precious and cared for meeting a stone floor and becoming nothing more than a mess to be swept away. For a moment, it was the only sound in the grand cold hall of Blackmore Manor. Then came the childish gasp, a tiny ragged intake of air that was more terrible in its silence than any scream. Frances stood frozen, her hands still outstretched as if she could recall the heavy vase from its fate. Her charge for the afternoon, the Duke of Blackmore's daughter, was a pale, still statue beside the glittering wreckage. Lady Lily, a child of 6, who had not spoken a word in the 6 months since her mother's death, now stared at the scattered white roses and jagged blue shards with a horror that was absolute. Her small body trembled, a leaf in a gale. It had not been her fault. Not really. Her aunt, Lady Cromer, had insisted Frances carry the flowers from the receiving room. Make yourself useful, girl," she had hissed, her rings glinting as she gestured vaguely. The Duke detested wilting things. So Frances had lifted the heavy vase, its water chilling her gloved hands, and had tried to navigate the polished floors while keeping an eye on the silent child who had been entrusted to her for the hour. Lily had drifted like a ghost through the halls of her own home, and in a moment of distraction, her small, sad form had collided with Frances's elbow. The crash echoed, and it summoned him. He came not from the grand staircase but from the shadows of his study, moving with a speed that was unnerving in a man of his station. Alistair Vane, the Duke of Blackmore, was a figure carved from granite and grief. The world saw him as powerful, controlled, a master of his vast estates. Frances, in the 2 days she had been a guest in his house, a reluctant appendage to her aunt's visita, had seen only a man hollowed out by loss. But now his face was a mask of cold fury. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, did not see the trembling child. They did not see the spilled water soaking into the priceless rug. They saw only the flowers, the white roses scattered like fallen soldiers, and Francis standing in the middle of the devastation. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The chill that emanated from him was more potent than any shout. He spoke to the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who had appeared as if by magic, her face pale with apprehension. Get rid of it," the Duke said, his voice low and tight. He gestured with a flick of his wrist, not at the mess on the floor, but at Frances herself. Throw her out before supper." The words landed like stones. There was no room for misunderstanding, no space for appeal. Throw her out. The phrase, so brutal and dismissive, echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the hall. It was the language one used for a stray dog, for rubbish. Frances felt the blood drain from her face, but years of service as her aunt's unpaid companion had taught her the art of stillness. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply stood there, a statue of composure, while her world fractured around her. The crime, she knew, was not the broken vase. The crime was her own inconsequence. The Duke turned his back on her. Then, his attention finally falling to his daughter, he knelt, but there was a stiffness in his movement, a distance. He reached for Lily, but the child flinched away from him, her gaze still fixed on the ruined flowers, her small hands pressed to her mouth, as if to hold in the scream she could not voice. The Duke's jaw tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his features before it was locked away again behind the granite mask. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He straightened up, gave one last, cold look at the scene, and walked back into his study, the heavy oak door closing with a soft, final click. He had left her to be disposed of. Miss Goblet's voice was soft, laced with a pity that was almost harder to bear than the Duke's contempt. Come with me." Frances followed the housekeeper, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from her body. She did not look at her aunt, who was watching from the archway of the drawing-room, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Lady Cromer had been trying to be rid of Francis for years, and it seemed the Duke of Blackmore had just provided the perfect, public excuse. They walked through a labyrinth of service corridors, the opulent chill of the main house giving way to a plainer, warmer air. Mrs. Gable led her not to the front door, but to a small, quiet sitting room near the kitchens. A fire was lit in the hearth, and the scent of baking bread hung in the air. It was a world away from the frozen grief of the grand halls. Sit," the housekeeper commanded gently. "I'll bring you some tea." His Grace, he is not himself. Francis sat on the edge of a worn chintz armchair. Not himself. The phrase was meant to be a comfort, an excuse. But Francis had seen the man's eyes. That cold fury felt less like a departure and more like the man's truest self, unearthed by a moment of stress. He was a man consumed by a wound, and he was bleeding his pain onto everyone around him. She should have been terrified. She was being cast out without a reference, her name likely blackened in every great house in the county. Her aunt would abandon her to her fate with righteous pronouncements of Frances's clumsiness and ingratitude. She would be destitute, but beneath the humiliation, a strange, cold calm was settling in her. It was the calm of the survivor, the quiet resilience of a woman who had been made to feel like furniture her entire life. She had been useful, she had been overlooked, and now she was being discarded. It was the natural progression of things, self-sufficient. The word for a horse that did not need to be fed. She looked at her hands, still pristine in their white gloves, now spotted with water from the vase. She stripped them off slowly. Her fingers were stained with ink from balancing her aunt's household accounts late the night before. She was a poor relation, a companion, but she was also a bookkeeper, a manager, a planner. Her father, a gentle man ruined by a friendless bad investment, had taught her letters and numbers. Believing a good mind was a woman's only true dowry. It had not saved him, nor had it saved her from a life of genteel servitude. Mrs. Gable returned with a tray. The steam from the teapot was a small, comforting cloud. His Grace's man is arranging for your aunt's carriage to be brought round after supper," she said, avoiding Francis's eyes. "There is no need for you to beer." Harried, it was a small kindness, but a profound one. Mrs. Gable was defying the spirit, if not the letter, of the Duke's command. She was offering Francis a moment of dignity before the final expulsion. "A thank you, Mrs. Bruzin." "Gable," Francis said, her voice steady, "you are very kind." The housekeeper just nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The child, Lady Lily. She has been silent since the Duchess's accident. And flowers, she cannot bear them." The Duchess loved roses. His Grace filled the house with them after she was gone, thinking it a tribute. He does not see that for the child. It is a torment, and there it was. The piece of the puzzle that made the Duke's reaction, if not excusable, then at least understandable. He was not just a cold man, he was a grieving man, blind to the true nature of his own chilled sorrow. He was trying to honor a ghost, and, in doing so, was haunting his own daughter. Frances sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. She was waiting for the end, waiting for the carriage that would take her away to an unknown, likely bleak, future. She had a few hours of reprieve in this warm, quiet room. She had not been thrown out before supper. Not yet. And it is a strange thing, child, how fate turns on the smallest of hinges. A delayed carriage, a kind housekeeper, a ledger left open on a desk. A man's ruin can be a woman's opportunity if she has the courage to see it. And Frances, for all her quiet composure, had a spine of pure steel. The crisis, when it came, had nothing to do with broken porcelain. It arrived in the form of a man in a perfectly tailored coat, his face a mask of concerned professionalism. Mr. Finch, the Duke's solicitor and man of business, strode through the main hall with an air of immense self-importance. He carried a leather portfolio, and his expression was grave. From his vantage point in the study, Alistair watched Finch's approach through the gap in the curtains. He had retreated to this room, his sanctuary, but it offered no peace. The ghost of his wife, Eleanor, was everywhere, in the scent of rose potpourri she had made, in the silver frame on his desk holding her smiling face, in the suffocating silence of the house. His outburst in the hall had been monstrous, he knew that. The sight of the roses, Eleanor's flowers, strewn on the floor by that plain, quiet woman, had ignited a rage in him that was really a form of despair. He was failing. Failing Lily, failing Eleanor's memory, failing his title. The house was cold, the accounts were a mess, and his daughter was lost to him in a silent world he could not enter. Guilt was a poison he drank every morning. He had been with Eleanor that day. He had been the one to suggest the ride. He had held her hand as the doctor pronounced it hopeless. He had failed to save her, and now he was failing to save the child she had left behind. Finch entered without knocking, a liberty no one else would dare take. "Your Grace," he said, his voice a low hum of urgency. "I am afraid the news from London is not good. The consortium is calling in the loans." All of them. He spread a sheaf of papers across the vast mahogany desk. Columns of figures marched in neat, damning rows. Alistair stared at them. It was a language he was supposed to understand, the language of his inheritance, but the numbers swam before his eyes. Since Eleanor's death, he had left the running of the estate almost entirely to Finch. The man was efficient, trusted. His father is solicitor before him. They cannot, Alistair said, his voice rough. The agreement was for another year. They found a loophole, Your Grace. A clause pertaining to the estate's profitability, or lack thereof, Finch said smoothly. They are claiming mismanagement. They say the estate is bleeding money. These figures, he tapped a long, elegant finger on a final staggering number at the bottom of a page, suggest they are correct. We are on the verge of ruin. Ruin. The word was an absurdity. He was the Duke of Blackmore. Blackmore did not face ruin. What do you propose? Alistair asked, his head pounding. A consolidation. I have drawn up the necessary documents. We sell the northern farms. The price is poor, a buyer's market, but it will satisfy the immediate debt and buy us time. You must sign them tonight. My courier leaves for London on the morning tide. Finch pushed a thick document and a pen towards him. It felt wrong. Selling the northern farms, land that had been in his family for 300 years. It felt like another failure, another piece of his legacy crumbling to dust. He looked at the document, at the dense block of legal text, the neat signature line waiting for his name. He felt a wave of nausea. He was being asked to amputate a limb to save the body, and he did not even understand the diagnosis. Meanwhile, Frances had been summoned by her aunt. Lady Cromer was in a fury, not of sympathy, but of inconvenience. "The Duke has ordered our carriage for 10, she snapped, pacing the guest suite. At 10. I am to be hustled out of this house in the dark, because of your infernal clumsiness. You have made me a laughingstock." Frances said nothing, simply continuing to fold her few belongings into a small trunk. "And what is to become of you?" her aunt continued, rounding on her. "No reference, no prospects. You will end up on the street. I wash my hands of you, Frances. I have housed and fed you for 10 years. My charity has its limits. My crime was that I was chosen first," Frances thought, a line from a play her father had loved. Her aunt's own daughter, a vapid but pretty girl, had married well. Frances, the plain, intelligent cousin, had been a constant, quiet reproach to Lady Cromer's sense of maternal triumph. A maid knocked. A message. "Gable, my lady. The Duke requires Miss Plananger, Miss Francature, to attend him in the study, immediately." Lady Cromer stared, her mouth agape. "The Duke wants to see her? To what?" "Dismiss her, in person." A cruel, hopeful light entered her eyes. Frances felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. A personal dismissal, a final twist of the knife. She smoothed her gray dress, lifted her chin, and walked towards the Lyonnaise den. She did not expect to be saved. She did not hope for it. Hope was a luxury she had long ago learned to do without. The door to the study was ajar. She heard the low murmur of voices. She raised a hand to knock, but paused. Through the gap, she could see the Duke, his back to her, and Mr. Finch, leaning over the desk, his finger tapping impatiently on a document. And on the corner of the desk, angled towards her, was a large, open ledger. It was the household accounts ledger. She recognized the binding. She had seen it in the housekeeper's office. Even from this distance, her eye, trained by years of meticulous accounting, caught something, a series of entries for agricultural supplies. The sums were vast, far more than an estate this size should require. And the data, they were clustered, illogical. Then she saw it, a smudge, an alteration. The number of 300 had been clumsily changed to a 800, and next to it, another entry for the same supplier on the same day. A classic error of the embezzler, grown bold, a duplicated invoice, carelessly recorded. It was a flicker, a single wrong note in a complex composition of fraud. But to Frances's trained eye, it screamed. This was the moment. She could turn and walk away, she could go to her fate, be dismissed, and cast out. It was the safe thing to do, the sensible thing for a woman in her position. Or she could step through that door. She could speak. She took a breath and knocked. The two men looked up startled. The Duke's face was a thundercloud. What is it? I gave orders, your grace. You sent for me. Frances said, her voice quiet but clear. She stepped into the room, her gaze not on the Duke, but on the ledger. I did, he said, his voice clipped. To inform you that your aunt's carriage is ready. You may leave at your convenience. It was a marginally more polite version of a throw her out. But the intent was the same. Before I go, Frances said, taking another step into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. I wonder if you would permit me one observation. His eyes narrowing. The Duke is extremely busy, Missa. Frances, she said, her eyes finally meeting the Duke's. Your Grace, I believe you are about to sell the northern farms to cover a debt that does not exist. Silence. Thick, stunned silence. Alistair stared at her, the woman from the hall. The plain, quiet creature who had shattered the peace of his house. She was looking at him with an unnerving intensity, her gray eyes clear and direct. There was no hysteria in her, no pleading. Just a statement of fact, as calm as if she were announcing that it was raining. Explain yourself, he said, his voice dangerously low. She walked to the desk. She did not touch the ledger, but pointed at that entry, and that one for the same supplier, on the same date, for identical amounts. And this one here, the ink is smudged, the number has been altered. These are not debts, Your Grace. They are thefts. Finch let out a short, sharp laugh. This is absurd, Your Grace. The woman is clearly overwrought, grieving, perhaps, for her position. But Alistair was not looking at Finch. He was looking at Frances. He had noticed her earlier in the background of his own misery. He had noticed her quiet efficiency, the way she calmed a nervous horse, the way she had spoken softly to a scullery maid who had dropped a tray. He noticed things. It was a curse. He had noticed the way she had stood her ground in the hall, absorbing his cruelty without crumbling. He had dismissed her as a nuisance. But now he saw something else. He saw intelligence. He saw courage. He picked up a letter opener and used the tip to point to the entry she had indicated. Mr. Finch, explain this. The solicitor's face had gone pale. A simple clerical error, Your Grace. The sums are vast. Mistakes happen. Two mistakes? Frances asked quietly. And a third that has been deliberately obscured. That is not error, Your Grace. That is a pattern. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford, her aunt's words. But this was not an opinion. This was a fact, as solid and cold as the numbers on the page. Alistair looked from Finch's sweating face to Frances's calm one. He saw the flicker of panic in his solicitor's eyes, and the unwavering certainty in hers, and in that moment, he made a choice. He pushed the document Finch had wanted him to sign to the far side of the desk. Mr. Finch," he said, his voice like ice. You will leave the ledgers, all of them. And you will wait in the blue drawing room until I call for you. Appa. Your Grace. The courier. The courier can wait, Alistair said Aleve. Finch gathered his papers, his hands trembling slightly. He cast a look of pure venom at Francis, then bowed stiffly and exited the room. The Duke and the dismissed companion were alone. The air crackled with unspoken things. The fire in the hearth spat and settled. You have a head for numbers," Alistair stated. It was not a question. My father believed it was more useful than a head for needlepoint," she replied. He walked to the window and looked out into the gathering dusk. The grounds of Blackmore were darkening, the great oaks turning to silhouettes against a bruised purple sky. He was standing on a precipice, and the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. The one man he had trusted was likely a thief, and the only person who had seen it was a woman he had ordered thrown out of his house not 2 hours before. The irony was not lost on him. He turned back to face her. "I am in need of someone with a head for numbers, Miss Francis," he said. The formal address was a subtle shift, an acknowledgement of her new status. She was no longer just her. "I need someone to go through every ledger, every receipt, every account for the last 5 years. I need to know the extent of this pattern." He was offering her a job, a way out of the abyss. Gratitude washed over her, so sharp it was, almost painful. She opened her mouth to accept, to thank him, but then she stopped. She thought of the cold halls, the silent grieving child. She thought of his earlier command, the casual cruelty of it. To be his employee would be to be his servant. She would be Mrs. Gable, with a pen, another person to be ordered about and dismissed on a whim. She would not enter his house as decoration. She would not be ignored until needed. No, she said. He blinked. He was a duke. People did not say no to him. No, I will not be your clerk. Your Grace, she said, her voice gaining strength. I will not sit in a dusty office and be paid a wage to clean up Mr. Generous Finchaw's mess, only to be dismissed again the moment my usefulness is at an end. She took a breath, amazed at her own audacity. If I am to do this, I will not be a servant. I will have full and unrestricted access to every document. I will have the authority to question any member of your staff, including yourself. I will report to you, and you alone. And my findings, whatever they may be, will be acted upon. Oz. She paused, and then added the one thing that had been haunting her since the crash in the hall. And one more thing. The flowers. They must all be removed from the house. Every last one. And no one is to speak of them till Lady Lily. The child's grief is not a decoration to be managed. It is a wound to be healed. And it cannot heal while you are pouring salt in it daily. He stared at her, his face unreadable. She had not only refused him, she had given him orders. She had trespassed from the world of numbers into the sacred broken territory of his family. She had told him how to care for his own child. She expected fury. She expected to be thrown out for good this time. Instead, after a long, heavy silence, he nodded, slowly. Very well, he said. The words seemed to cost him something. Those are acceptable terms. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Not the clumsy companion, not the ink-stained clerk, but something else, entirely. A force. I find myself in a position where I must trust you. I do not like it. A trust is not the issue, Your Grace, she said. A competence is. You can trust my competence. A flicker of something, was it amusement? Respect, crossed his face. Indeed. He gestured to the chair opposite his own at the great mahogany desk. Please, sit. We have much to discuss. The clock on the mantelpiece began to chime the hour for supper. Frances walked to the desk and sat down. The leather of the chair was cool against her back. The wood of the desk was solid beneath her hands. Outside, the last light of day was fading. Dusk was falling on Blackmore Manor, and she, who had been ordered thrown out before supper, was seated at the Duca's table. The war had just begun. The first days were a campaign fought in silence and ink. The Duca's study became Frances's command post, the vast desk, her battlefield. Piles of ledgers, receipts, and correspondence grew around her like fortifications. Alistair had been true to his word. An army of footmen had been dispatched to strip the house of every flower, every petal, every botanical print. The air, once thick with the funereal scent of roses, now smelled only of beeswax and old paper. Lady Cromer had departed in a storm of outrage, her final volley a hissed prediction that Frances would come to a bad end. Finch had been dismissed, sent away under a cloud of threats and veiled promises of prosecution that Alistair, for now, seemed too weary to pursue. The solicitor's absence left a vacuum, one that Frances was now expected to fill. She worked from dawn until her eyes burned from the candlelight late at night. The house watched her. She felt its gaze from every doorway. The staff, loyal to the memory of the late Duchess, and suspicious of this plain-faced interloper, moved around her with a quiet, resentful efficiency. They called her a Miss Francia, but the title was brittle. They were waiting for her to fail, to be the next in a long line of governesses, companions and well-meaning ladies, who had tried and failed to pierce the veil of grief that shrouded Blackmore. And at the heart of the fortress was Lily. Frances saw the child only in fleeting glimpses. A pale face in an upper window, a small shape flitting through the far end of a corridor. The nursery wing was a separate kingdom, ruled by a stern, unsmiling nurse, who made it clear she answered only to the Duke. Frances had won the Battle of the Flowers, but the war for the childless world was yet to be fought. She did not try to force an entry. She knew from her own childhood that a locked heart cannot be broken into. It must be coaxed to open from the inside. Instead, she began her siege by quiet observation. She learned that Lily ate almost nothing. She learned that the child spent hours tracing patterns in the dust on the windowsills of the unused, south-facing rooms. One afternoon, driven from the ledgers by a pounding headache, Frances walked the length of the south gallery. It was a long, cold hall, the furniture shrouded in white cloths like a congregation of ghosts. And there, in the dust of a long-neglected windowsill, was a perfectly formed, looping aloe. And next to it, an awe. The child was not just tracing patterns, she was writing. The next morning, before the maids came with their dusters, Frances left a small new slate and a piece of chalk on the windowsill. She did not linger. She did not mention it. She simply left the offering. When she returned that evening, the slate was gone. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was a sign that someone was listening in the silent house. Alistair remained a distant, brooding presence. He would appear in the study at odd hours, standing by the fire, watching her work. He rarely spoke. The conversations were transactional, focused on the ever-deepening mire of Finch's fraud. The man hadn't just been stealing. He had been systematically dismantling the estate's profitability, creating a web of false debt and failed investments that was as intricate as it was devastating. Francesa's initial discovery had been the tip of a colossal iceberg. He was selling our own timber back to us at inflated prices, she said one evening, looking up from a particularly convoluted shipping manifest. Through a holding company registered in his cousin's name. Alistra's jaw tightened. The muscle working under the skin. The man I trusted with my daughter's inheritance. I knew you were distracted, Frances said, her voice softer than she intended. A grief makes a man blind. He looked at her sharply. And what would you know of grief? The question was a challenge. A dismissal of her right to comment on his sacred sorrow. She could have retreated, murmured an apology. Instead, She met his gaze. "I know what it is to lose everything. Your Grace," she said quietly. My father died, believing he was a failure. The man he trusted ruined him, and he carried the shame of it to his grave. I know that grief is not just sadness. It is anger. It is confusion. And sometime it is a convenient excuse to stop living." The words hung in the air between them, brutally honest. She had overstepped. She had crossed the line from employee to something far more dangerous, a person who saw him. He did not reply. He simply stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists. For a long moment she thought he would order her out again. Instead, he said, "A supper is in an hour. Mrs. Gable will show you to your new rooms. You cannot continue to work and sleep in this office." He left without another word. Mrs. Gable arrived a few minutes later, her expression one of barely concealed surprise. She led Francis, not to a guest room, but to a comfortable suite in the family wing, 2 doors down from the Duca's own. The rooms were warm, the fire was lit, and on the dressing table was a small, leather-bound book. His Grace thought you might find this useful," the housekeeper said. Was the late Duchess' journal. Francis picked it up. The cover was worn smooth. It felt impossibly intimate, a trespass. She was a bookkeeper, a solver of financial puzzles. She had no place here, in the heart of the family's grief. And yet, here she was. The Duke had not answered her charge, but he had responded. He had moved her closer. He had given her a key. That night, she did not work on the ledgers. She sat by the fire in her new room, and with trembling fingers, opened the Duchess's journal. It was not a diary of feelings, but a record of a life, lived with open eyes. Eleanor Vane had been a botanist, an artist, a collector of small wonders. The pages were filled with exquisite, detailed sketches of wildflowers, with notes on their properties, their folklore, and pressed between the pages were the ghosts of the flowers themselves. A faded violet, the skeleton of a Queen Anne's lace, a single paper-thin poppy petal, and there was something else. Woven through the botanical notes were lullabies, little rhymes, and songs Eleanor had written for her daughter. Frances read them aloud, her voice a whisper in the quiet room. They were songs of sunlight and growing things, of ladybugs and buzzing bees. They were songs from a world that was no longer allowed inside Blackmore's walls. The next afternoon, she took the journal with her and went to the nursery. The nurse, a woman named Mrs. Hetty, barred the door with her formidable presence. "A Lady Lily is resting," she said, her arms crossed. "I will not disturb her." Frances said calmly. "I will simply be sitting in the window seat, reading." She did not wait for permission, but swept past the sputtering nurse and into the large, cold playroom. Lily was in the corner, building a tower of blocks, her back to the room. She did not look up. Frances settled into the window seat, the Duchess's journal open in her lap. She did not speak to Lily. She did not even look at her. She simply began to read aloud, her voice low and even, reciting the names of the flowers Eleanor had drawn. A centaurea, cyanus, cornflower. Its petals are the color of a summer sky. She read about daisies and buttercups, about the vetch that climbed the hedgerows, and the clover that sweetened the fields. She read the little lullabies, humming the simple tunes. She filled the cold, silent room with the gentle ghost of Eleanor's voice, with the world of life and color that had been banished for an hour. There was no response. The only sound was her voice and the soft click of Lilia's wooden blocks. Finally, as the light began to fade, Frances closed the book. "A will come back tomorrow," she said to the silent room, and left. She did this for 3 days. On the 4th day, as she was reading about the intricate patterns on a foxglove, a small, warm body pressed against her side, Lily had left her blocks and crept over to the window seat. She did not speak. She simply leaned against Frances, her small finger tracing the drawing of the flower in the book. Progress was not a breakthrough. It was the slow, patient accretion of small trusts. It was a slate left on a windowsill, a journal read aloud, a small body leaning against hers in a moment of shared quiet. Alistair began to change too. He started appearing for supper, not just in his study, but in the small family dining room. The first time, it was just the two of them at a long, polished table, the silence between them as vast as the room itself. Of the estate tenants are petitioning for rent relief, he said abruptly, breaking the silence. The harvest was poor. A Finch sold the grain futures in the spring at a ruinously low price. Ought, Frances replied, without looking up from her plate. I saw the contracts. There is no money to relieve them with. So we tell them. No. Or, she said, finally, meeting his eyes. Or, she said, you explain the situation. You tell them you were cheated as badly as they were. You open the home farm as stores. It will not be enough. But it will be something. A gesture of good faith. It is a gesture of weakness, he countered, the old aristocratic pride flaring. Duke does not explain himself to his tenants. A man who wishes to keep his tenants does, she said simply. He lapsed into a brooding silence, but the next morning she saw him riding out, not on his hunter toward the open moors, but on a steady cob towards the tenant farms. He had started to listen. The thaw came during a storm. A great, roaring beast of a storm that swept in from the sea and rattled the very bones of the manor. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, and the wind howled like a banshee. Frances, working late in the study, saw the light in the nursery wing flicking on and off. She thought of Lily, alone in the dark, with the roaring wind. She found the child not in her bed, but under it, a small trembling ball wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Hetty was nowhere to be seen. Frances knelt on the cold floorboards. "A Lily?" she whispered. A small, terrified face peered out. Frances did not try to coax her out. She simply lay down on the rug, pulling a corner of the blanket for herself. It is a very loud storm, isn't it?" she said, as if they were discussing the weather over tea. My father used to say that thunder was just the angels bowling." She lay there in the dark, under the bed, and she began to sing. She sang the little lullabies from Eleanor's journal, her voice a low, steady anchor in the tumult of the storm. She sang of sleepy poppies and moonlit gardens. After a long time, a tiny voice, rusty from disuse, whispered from the darkness. Again, Frances's heart stopped. She had to fight the urge to weep, to gather the child in her arms. Instead, she just smiled in the dark and began to sing again. She did not know how long they lay there. At some point, the storm began to subside. A sliver of light appeared under the door. A man's shadow fell across it. Alistair stood in the doorway, his face a wreck of emotions. He had been woken by the storm and had come to check on his daughter, his heart pounding with a nameless dread. He had expected to find her screaming, or worse, catatonically silent. Instead, he had heard singing. And then, that one impossible word. He watched as Frances, his quiet, fiercely competent bookkeeper, lay on the floor of the nursery, her voice a gentle murmur, holding his broken child together with nothing but a song. He saw, not an employee, not an interloper, but the first warmth the house had felt in months. She had done what he, with all his power and wealth, could not. She had found the key to the locked room of his Doris heart. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had thought he needed her to save his fortune. He had been wrong. He needed her to save his soul. He backed away from the door unseen. He went not to his own room, but to the cold, grand gallery where Eleanor's portrait hung. He stood before it for a long time, the painted eyes smiling down at him. "I am sorry," he whispered to the ghost. "I am so sorry. I could not keep her safe. I could not keep either of you safe." The guilt that had been his constant companion felt sharper than ever, but it was now joined by something new, a fragile, terrifying sliver of hope. The storm had passed. But in its wake, something had broken open. The house had held its breath for 6 months. And now, finally, it felt as though it might be able to breathe again. The shift in the house was palpable. It began with sound. The sound of Lilier's voice. At first, a whisper, then a trickle, then a small clear stream. She did not speak in sentences, but in single words, questions and statements dropped like pebbles into the quiet pools of the day. A slate, she would ask, appearing at Francia's elbow in the study. A sing, she would demand at bedtime. Frances became the center of the childless orbit, the fixed point around which Lilia's tentative new world revolved. And Alistair, from a distance, watched it all. He began to orchestrate his days around the possibility of seeing them. He would find reasons to be in the library when he knew Frances was returning a book, or walk the grounds near the walled garden where she had begun to take Lily for fresh air. He was a man observing a miracle and terrified of frightening it away. Men do not always care to be seen, and dukes are often the most hidden of all. But Alistair found he desperately wanted to be seen by her. He saw her patience, the endless, steady well of it. He saw her teaching Lily the alphabet, not from a primer, but by tracing the letters on the frosted panes of the winter glass. He saw her coax Lily to eat, not with threats or pleas, but by shaping the mashed potatoes into a smiling face. Each small act of kindness was a quiet indictment of his own fumbling, grief-stricken neglect. He was in his study one afternoon when they came in, their cheeks pink from the cold, a small shared conspiracy between them. Lily was clutching something in her mitten. Show him," Frances prompted gently. Lily held out her hand. On her palm lay a single perfect pine cone. "A for Mama's grave," Lily said her first full sentence to him in half a year. So, she is not lonely." Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. He had not visited Eleanor's grave since the funeral. The thought of it was a physical pain. But Lily was looking at him, her eyes, Eleanor's eyes, wide and expectant. And Frances was watching him, her expression not judging, but simply waiting. "Yes," he heard himself say, his voice thick. "A yes, of course. We will take it to her." They walked together, the three of them, through the cold, crisp air to the small churchyard. Alistair held Lilia's hand, her small fingers, a warm, living weight in his. Frances walked a little apart, giving them space. At the simple marble headstone, Lily carefully placed the pine cone at the base. There," she whispered. Alistair looked at the name carved in the stone, Eleanor Vane. Beloved wife and mother. The grief was still there, a great, hollow ache, but for the first time, it was not accompanied by the crushing weight of guilt. It was just a memory, not a wound. On the walk back, Lily, skipping ahead, began to hum one of the lullabies from the journal. Alistair fell into step beside Frances. Thank you, he said, the words inadequate. "I did nothing, she replied. Lily is the one who is brave." No," he said, stopping and turning to face her. "You did everything. You walked into a house full of silence and you taught it how to sing again." The moment was charged, intimate. The space between them felt suddenly small. He wanted to reach for her, to touch her hand, to tell her what. He did not have the words. He had inherited a dukedom, but not the language of the heart. It was in that fragile, hopeful space that the enemy chose to strike. Mr. Finch had not been idle. He had retreated, but only to marshal his forces. He understood that his financial attack had failed because of Frances. To succeed, he had to remove her, and so he changed his line of attack from the Duke's finances to his fitness as a father. The first salvo was a letter, delivered by a solicitor from the nearby town. It was from Alistair's uncle, Lord Ellesmere, a pompous and grasping man who had always been jealous of his brother's title. The letter expressed grave concern over the well-being of Lady Lily. It spoke of whispers in the county, of the Duke's reclusiveness, his instability, and, most damningly, the unsuitable influence of a woman of a questionable character, who had installed herself in the house. "What is this?" a lister demanded, slamming the letter down on the desk. Frances read it, her face pale. "A tas Finch," she said. "A has, using your uncle. Haste poisoning the well. Turning your own family against you." The letter was followed by visitors. Former friends of the family, local gossips, all arriving under the guise of paying their respects, their eyes sharp and searching, looking for evidence of madness and impropriety. They saw a quiet, plain woman at the Duke's side, and a child who, while speaking, was still shy and reserved. They saw what they had been told to see, a household in disarray, run by an adventuress. Her past was the weapon Finch chose to use. The story of her dismissal was resurrected, twisted, and embellished. Lady Cromer, her own aunt, was only too happy to provide a sworn statement, painting Frances as a manipulative, dishonest schemer who had been caught trying to compromise her previous employer. The lie was so monstrous, so complete, that it was almost believable. The threat culminated in a formal petition, filed with the magistrate. Lord Ellesmere, acting as concerned next of kin, was petitioning for guardianship of Lady Lily and control of her considerable inheritance. The grounds were the Duca's mental incompetence and the presence of a morally corrupting influence in the home. A hearing was set for the following week. They were trying to take his child. The news landed like a death knell. All the progress, all the fragile warmth that had begun to seep into the house, seemed to evaporate. The cold returned, sharper and more bitter than before. Alistair retreated into himself, the old granite mask slipping back into place. He paced his study like a caged animal, the fear for Lily warring with a terrible, impotent rage. He had failed to protect Eleanor. Now they were saying he was failing to protect her daughter. The narrative of his own guilt was being used as the rope to hang him. Frances found him late one night, slumped in his chair, a half-empty decanter of brandy at his elbow. The ledgers, her work, lay forgotten. "We will fight this," she said, her voice fierce. "Ah, how?" he shot back, his voice ragged. "With what? Your numbers. They don't care about Finch's theft, they care about appearances. They care about scandal, and you, thanks to my esteemed aunt, are now the biggest scandal in the county." The cruelty of his words struck her, but she saw the fear behind them. He was lashing out, just as he had in the hall that first day. My reputation is not the issue," she said steadily. Lily is. We need to prove that this is a fit and loving home. And we need to expose Finch and your uncle for what they are, greedy men using a child as a pawn." "And how do we do that?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. They have affidavits. They have whispers. What do we have?" "A silent child and a disgraced companion." The injustice of it burned in her. She had spent her life being small, being quiet, being careful. She had swallowed insults, endured neglect, and maintained her dignity in the face of 1,000 daily humiliations. But this was different. They were not just attacking her, they were threatening a child. They were threatening the fragile home she had helped to build. She walked over to him, and for the first time, she closed the distance between them. She put her hand on his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. "Daddids. We have the truth," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. And we have each other." He looked up at her, his eyes full of a terrible vulnerability. The mask was gone. She saw not the Duke but Alistair, a man drowning, reaching for a lifeline. He covered her hand with his grip surprisingly tight, desperate. Frances." He breathed her name. The sound a prayer or a plea. "I cannot lose her. The thought of them taking her, it would destroy me." He paused, his gaze searching hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I did not expect this. I did not expect you. When you came here, I saw only a problem. An inconvenience." Now, he stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. But the pressure of his hand, the raw honesty in his eyes, said more than words ever could. It was not a declaration of love, not a promise. It was a confession of need, a pressured, half-formed admission that she had become more than his bookkeeper, more than Lilia's companion. She had become essential. "A will not let them win," she said, and it was a vow. He held her gaze for a long moment, the world shrinking to the space between them. The fire, the ledgers, the looming thread, all faded away. There was only the warmth of his hand on hers, and the silent, terrifying, exhilarating promise of the fight to come. She stayed because she had given her word. But she knew, in that moment, that she was also staying, because to leave now would be to leave a part of herself behind. The cold house had claimed her, and she had in turn claimed it, and she would not surrender it without a war. The day of the hearing dawned gray and cold. A fine, miserable drizzle fell from a sky the color of slate, weeping onto the grand facade of Blackmore Manor. Inside, the house was unnaturally quiet, holding its breath. The setting for the reckoning was not a formal courtroom, but the grand library of the manor itself. The magistrate, Sir Roger Peel, a stern man with a reputation for incorruptible fairness, had agreed to hear the petition in private, a concession to the Duke's rank. But a private was a relative term. The room was full. Lord Ellesmere was there, looking pompous and self-righteous. His wife sat beside him, fanning herself, despite the chill. Several other cousins and trustees of the estate were present, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim concern. And in the corner, a silent, looming presence, was Mr. Finch, attending as Lord Ellesmere's legal adviser. Alistair stood by the great fireplace, his face pale but composed. He wore the formal black of a man in mourning, a subtle reminder of the origins of his family's sorrow. He looked every inch the Duke, but Frances, standing slightly behind him, could see the tension in his hands, clenched at his sides. She herself felt strangely calm. She had spent the last 3 days in a fever of preparation, not sleeping, barely eating. She had armed herself not with rhetoric, but with facts. Stacks of ledgers and documents were arranged on a side table, her ammunition for the battle ahead. And then there was Lily. After a long, fraught discussion, she and Alistair had agreed the child should not be present. They would not subject her to this. She was upstairs in the nursery with Mrs. Gable, a fresh slate and a box of colored chalks. Her only companions. Sir Roger Peel called the proceedings to order. Lord Ellesmere's solicitor, a florid man with a booming voice, began. He painted a masterful picture of a noble house in decline, of a duke lost in a fog of grief, neglecting his duties, and most tragically, his only child. He spoke of the estate as near bankruptcy, presenting it as evidence of the Duke's incompetence, conveniently omitting Finch's role. Then he turned his attention to Frances. "Ah, and into this void," he thundered. "A steps. This woman. This Miss Frances, whose origins are obscure and whose motives are suspect. A woman who by her own aunt's testimony is a practiced manipulator, an adventuress of the worst sort." He produced Lady Cromer's sworn affidavit and read from it with relish. The words were a cascade of vicious lies, twisting Frances's years of quiet service into a long campaign of subtle scheming. She listened without expression, her hands folded in her lap. To react would be to give them victory. When he was finished, Sir Roger Peel looked at Frances, his expression unreadable. "Miss Frances, do you have anything to say in response to these serious allegations?" All eyes turned her. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a confrontation. The drama. They expected tears, denials, hysterics. Frances stood. She did not look at the solicitor, or at her accusers. She looked directly at Sir Roger. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, audible in the silent room. "My character is not on trial here. The well-being of a child is. These gentlemen have made claims about the Duke's management of his estate. I believe the estate's own records can speak to that." She walked to the side table. There was no theatricality in her movement, only a quiet purpose. She picked up the top ledger, a Lord Elsmeria's counsel. Claims the estate is failing due to the Duca's neglect, she began. This ledger shows that for the 3 years prior to the Duchess's death, the estate returned a healthy profit. The decline began exactly 6 months ago. Tay codified. The same month, Mr. Finch was granted full authority over the accounts. She then proceeded, with methodical, irrefutable clarity, to dismantle their case, piece by piece. She used, not emotion, but numbers. She laid out the evidence of Finch's systematic fraud, the ghost employees, the dummy corporations, the inflated invoices, the timber sold and bought back at a loss. She spoke not as an accused woman, but as an expert witness, her voice never wavering. For every accusation of ducal incompetence, she provided a clear, documented example of Finch's criminal malfeasance. The room grew colder, the silence deeper. Finch's face was ashen. Lord Ellesmere was beginning to look less righteous and more foolish. Alistair watched her, a look of profound, aching pride on his face. She was magnificent. She was a warrior armed with truth. When she finished, she closed the final ledger. The estate is not failing because of the Duca's grief, Sir Roger. The estate is being systematically robbed by the man advising the petitioner. Sir Roger Peel stared at the evidence, then at Finch. Mr. Finch, these are the most serious of allegations. Do you have a response, Finch? Cornered chose to attack. It is a fiction, he sputtered. A web of lies concocted by this woman to secure her position. She has bewitched the Duke. Ask the child. Ask Lady Lily what this woman has done. She has forbidden flowers. The Duchess's favorite thing. She has tried to erase the memory of the child's sainted mother. It was a desperate, ugly move. And it was a mistake. For at that moment, the library door opened. Mrs. Gables stood there, her face distraught, and behind her, holding her hand, was Lily. The child must have slipped away, drawn by the sound of raised voices, by the gravity that had settled over the house. A Lily? No, Alistair said, moving towards her. But Lilia's eyes were fixed on Finch. She had heard his final venomous words. She let go of Mrs. Gabelais' hand and walked into the center of the room. She was so small, a tiny figure in a sea of stunned adults. She looked at her father. She looked at Francis, a long, steady look of trust. Then she turned to Sir Roger Peel. It was not the flowers' fault, she said, her voice small but clear as a bell. It was an accident. Mamma's horse got scared. It was not anyone, Falte. She took a breath. Francis taught me that. She then turned her gaze, with all the solemn judgment a 6-year-old can muster, upon Mr. Gaze. Finch, you told me, she said, her voice ringing with accusation. That day, you told me it was my fault for wanting to pick the daisies. You said Mama was tired because of me. You lied. A collective gasp went through the room. It was the final, devastating blow. The Schimera's careful architecture of lies had been brought down by the simple, unassailable truth of a child. Finch crumbled. He seemed to shrink in his expensive suit, the blood draining from his face. Lord Ellesmere looked horrified, finally understanding that he had been a pawn in a much uglier game. Sir Roger Peel's face was like thunder. He looked at Finch with utter disgust. Mr. Finch, you will surrender all documents to my clerk. Your professional and personal conduct will be the subject of a most rigorous investigation. You are a disgrace to your profession. He then turned to Lord Ellesmere. As for this petition, it is dismissed. It is frivolous, malicious, and founded on falsehoods. You are fortunate, my lord, that the Duke does not choose to press charges for slander. The battle was over. The room began to empty, the defeated parties scurrying away like rats from a sinking ship. Soon only 3 people remained in the vast library: Alistair, Francis, and the small girl who had saved them all. Alistair knelt and opened his arms. Lily ran to him, burying her face in his coat. He held her tight, his eyes closed, his body shaking with relief and love. Over his daughter's head, he looked at Frances. His eyes were full of everything he could not say. The public victory was hers, but the private one was his. He had his daughter back. She had endured much. And here is the thing you must understand. The greatest victories are not won in the public square, but in the quiet rooms that follow. The world had been set right, but a heart, once broken, needs more than vindication to heal. It needs a confession. It needs a home. That night, after Lily was tucked safely in bed, her dreams now free of guilt, Frances found herself drawn back to the study. The ledgers were still there, silent witnesses to the day's battle. The room felt different, lighter. The air was still. Alistair found her there, standing before the fire, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her up. The day's adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness of the survivor. He did not speak at first, but came to stand beside her. They watched the flames dance, a comfortable silence, stretching between them where once there had been only tension. "I was a coward," he said at last, his voice low and rough. He did not look at her, but stared into the fire as if it were a confessional. After Eleanor died. I closed a door inside myself. I thought if I didn't feel anything, I couldn't feel the pain. I built a fortress of grief, and I locked Lily in there with me. I thought I was protecting her, but I was burying her. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark with remembered pain. And then you came. You didn't knock on the door. You didn't try to break it down. You just walked in and quietly started opening all the windows. He took a step closer. That first day in the hall. My words to Mrs. Gabela, they were monstrous. I know that. I saw the roses, Eleanor's roses, shattered on the floor, and all the rage and grief I had been choking on came pouring out. It wasn't about you. It was about me. About my own failure. "I understand," she whispered. "No," he said, shaking his head. You shouldn't have to understand. You should have been angry. You should have run. But you stayed." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. His hand was warm, steady. You stayed. You fought for my daughter. You fought for my home. You fought for me when I had given up on fighting for myself." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I have been a fool, a blind, grieving fool. Frances, you became the heart of this house when I had forgotten it even had one." Her own heart was hammering, a wild bird in her chest. She had dreamed of a moment like this, but had never dared to believe it could be real. But a lifetime of caution, a lifetime of being useful rather than wanted, died hard. Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly. If this is gratitude, I cannot accept it. Do not say these things if it is only gratitude." He looked at her, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It transformed his stern features, chasing away the last of the shadows. "A gratitude," he said, his voice full of a soft wonder. Oh, my dear Frances, I am leagues beyond gratitude." He brought his other hand up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. This is not gratitude. This is desperation. The desperate, undeniable need not to be without you for another day of my life." Leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a practiced kiss, not the kiss of a worldly duke. It was clumsy and honest and full of a desperate, long overdue hope. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and tears and the promise of a new beginning. It was the kiss of a man coming home. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I need a wife by tomorrow," he murmured against her lips, his voice laced with a humor she had never heard before. She pulled back, her eyes wide. He chuckled a low, warm sound. "A joke, a terrible joke. Forgive me. I am new to this. He grew serious again. Marry me, Francis. Not as a bargain, not as a solution. Marry me, because this house is cold without you. Because my daughter loves you. Because I love you. The words she had never thought to hear. The words she had been so sure she did not deserve. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a lifetime of loneliness, finally melting away. "Ah, yes," she whispered. "Ah, yes, Alistair." Spring came to Blackmore, not with a sudden burst, but gently, tentatively, as if it, too, were learning to trust again. The sun warmed the old stones of the manor. The gardens, long neglected, were being coaxed back to life. Under the direction of the new Duchess, the house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of Lilia's laughter, with the murmur of conversation, with music from the pianoforte that had been silent for so long. The portrait of the late Duchess still hung in the gallery, but now there was a small vase of fresh-cut daisies on the table beneath it. The dead were not forgotten, but honored. The memories were no longer ghosts, but gentle presences. One bright afternoon, Frances was in the walled garden, a place that had been Eleanor's pride and had become Francesa's sanctuary. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands now, often bare of glovesay, gently tending to a bed of new rose bushes, a variety that bloomed not in funereal white, but in a cheerful, buttery yellow. Alistair came to find her there, Lily perched on his shoulders. He was a different man. The granite had softened, the grief had eased from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, steady joy. What are you plotting, Your Grace?" he asked, swinging Lily down to the ground. "A floral revolution," she said with a smile, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. Lily, who had become a fearless explorer of the garden, ran over to a patch of wild violets. She picked a single, perfect purple flower and ran back, holding it out to Frances. "For you, Mama," she said. The word as natural and easy as breathing. Frances took the flower, her heart full to bursting. She looked from the small, perfect bloom in her hand, to the child's shining face, to the man standing behind her, his eyes full of love. She had been brought to this house to be thrown out, a piece of inconvenient luggage. She had been seen as a problem to be solved, a mess to be swept away. But she had stayed. She had stayed through the cold and the silence, through the accusations and the fear. And in staying, she had done more than uncover a fraud or save an estate. She had reminded a man how to love and taught a child how to live. She had become not a replacement, not a bargain discharged, but the one who stayed. She was home.